Amen. Parable of Jesus. Parables of Jesus. So we're looking at the lamp under the basket. And for those of you that have joined us this week, we looked at the lamp under the basket last week, and that was version 1.0. This is now version 1.1. So we're just going to continue where we left off last week, okay? And decided to take a look at the first of what I recorded as being parables in my old study Bible, and that is that lamp under the basket. So there's the parables that are listed in my old study Bible, found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and various fashions, and the references are all up there. And what we noted last week, that this parable doesn't actually follow the classic parable structure. And the classic parable structure I went into last week, and it is basically outlined in at least 6 steps. So in the classic teaching, the classic parable would follow at least 6 sort of steps. First was the prolegomenon, and the prolegomenon was the thing that kicked it off, which would be a phrase like, what can this be compared to? Or the kingdom of heaven is like, or simply 2A. And this was the thing, the key word, the key phrase that began to tune the listener in, to prepare them for what was going to come next. What was the kingdom of heaven? What could it be compared to like? Secondly was your introduction to the cast. So once it was set up like that, you then get your introduction to the cast coming in. You know? And remember, we're talking Jewish context, because Jesus was a Jew, which is a shock to some people. Jesus is a Jew. He was working and living in a Jewish context, and he was teaching in a Jewish fashion. So straight away, Israel knew who they were in the cast. Israel knew they were the beloved. They were the bride of God. They were the son of the king. They were the vineyard. They were the choicest vines. Straight away. So as Jesus began to let the cast out the bag, Israel would be going, oh, that's us. That's us. He's about to talk about us now. They knew their place in the story. And then the plot line would continue. Plot line would continue, the plot was outlined, and the drama would then begin to be played out. And then fourthly, the plot unfolds, and we get a conflict. Always a conflict arises, and the conflict is normally between the different characters. This is the way that it flows. The servant and his master, the father and his son, the rich and the poor, the religious and the sinner. And then fifthly, we move into that stage of conflict resolution. Gets to that stage was how does it get resolved? What's the outcome? Does it get resolved? Is it resolved? Or are you left to go and work that out in your own head as you walk away? And then sixthly, we finally reach that point of application. How does this actually affect us today in our life? What does this actually mean for us? How is this content applied to the daily living? And how do we actually bring that to life for us today? What is the purpose behind this story? And the Jewish rabbis would have that little word, kach, which basically means, and thus it is also with. So as it was here, it's also like that here. This is what I'm teaching you about in the spiritual dimension here. This is how we apply it to our life here. Kach. And so this little similitude we're looking at sits really well within what we call the parable law, L-O-R-E, the parable law, and it sits really well within Jewish Haggadah. And the Haggadah would have been the typical style of teaching that the Jewish rabbis used. And for those, just a little reminder, Haggadah is the term which is used to describe a legend, a parable, or some sort of little anecdote to illustrate a point in the law, in the Talmud, in the Tanakh. And so the illustration we're looking at sits as one of those really contracted or concise sayings, and it draws on the actions of things, like the growth of a plant or the light of a lamp. And then it uses those things to then try and convey and bring this richer spiritual truth, deeper spiritual truth. And so using the Matthew account as the baseline, we saw that Matthew has divided his gospel, didn't we, up into 5 chunks. So Matthew's gospel is divided up into sort of 5 discourse areas or 5 chunks. And that really helps us to understand the emphasis that he, under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, was wanting to convey. Because remember, Scripture is 100% human as well as being 100% divine. And so chapters 5 to 7 deal with the question of how are the citizens of the kingdom supposed to live? This is pushing out the authoritative message of Messiah. And so 5 to 7 deal with this whole Sermon on the Mount, where this little parable, this little similitude sits that we're looking at. It's all part of the Sermon on the Mount teaching. Chapter 10 talks about how the disciples are supposed to conduct themselves on their evangelistic journeys, which is the authoritative mission of Messiah moving forward. The authoritative mission of Messiah's messengers. How are they supposed to conduct themselves? Chapter 13 deals with, well, what parables did Jesus tell? And these are the mysteries of the Messianic kingdom, which are delivered in this parable style. And then chapters 18 to 20, what warnings did Jesus lay out about not hindering folk entering into the kingdom? And what did he say about forgiveness? And this talks about the whole community of what Messiah is revealed. And then finally we get to that fifth point, which is chapters 24 and 25. How will human history end? How will human history end? It's seeking to answer that question. And it talks about the delay, the return, and the judgment of Messiah. And it wraps up in what's called the Olivet Discourse. So it's bookended. Sermon on the Mount kicks off. Closes Olivet Discourse. Mountain to mountain. They're your bookends. And Matthew has shaped his gospel message like this. Really important we understand this, because if we miss this, we miss the meanings that the writer is trying to convey to us. As I've said before, none of the teaching of Jesus was in isolation of his cultural context, nor was it in isolation of the actual flow of events that was going on around him. There was stuff happening every single day that he would be looking at, he would be seeing, and that would be fed into the way that he spoke. And taking that understanding, we can see that this similitude that we're looking at, which featured in the first part of his discourse, the Sermon on the Mount. So this is where he told this story, during the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount was covering off how citizens of the kingdom are supposed to live. So you can't take that message out of what's Jesus trying to get across here. He's saying, I'm expecting you to live like this. And to illustrate, I'm going to give you a story. So if we make that story mean anything other than about how we're living, we're taking it out of the context that Jesus was teaching it in. Really important. Jesus is setting out a real practical ethic that his followers are being called to live by. He's not setting up some impossibly high moral standard or highlighting how far we are removed from God's standards that we're all going to fall over. You know, he didn't need to do that. He didn't need to do that because the people of Israel were already aware of the fact that there were 613 Mosaic laws that they had to try and negotiate every flipping day of their life. They didn't need to be told that they couldn't keep them. They knew it. As soon as they got out of bed, they'd have broken one of them. They knew it. Jesus' teaching was presenting real, challenging, practical ethics to live life by in the real world amongst real people. So it appears then that Jesus, in looking to show how folk are supposed to live, in this little similitude of the lamp, he singled out a sectarian group, which we looked at last week, the Essenes. And the Essenes lived out in Qumran. And he opened the little saying by saying this, didn't he? Matthew 5:14-16. You are the light of the world. A city located on a hill cannot be hidden. People do not light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before people so that they can see your good deeds and give honour to your Father in heaven. And as we looked at those first two sentences last week, we saw that Jesus was informing his listeners that they were the light of the world. They, you. But the sons of light were how the Essenes referred to themselves. So the Essenes saw themselves as the sons of... And Jesus was calling all this out. Remember, light corrects darkness because it enhances, it promotes, it produces, and is conducive for life. Because without light, there is only chaos. And Jesus straight away was making a distinction. He was saying to the people listening to him on that mountain, you at the back there, you over there. You are the light of the world. You are the ones who are supposed to be enhancing, promoting, producing really good stuff that is conducive to life. You. All of that good stuff. You. Because that is what mirrors God's creation. God himself, and it's reflected in his works. And you are supposed to be doing that. You are that person. You are the one that is given the task of reflecting the goodness of God to those around you. Not the Essenes, the ones sat over there, because they're not actually doing that. They're not actually doing what God has called them to do, which is to reflect his light. And to confirm that, we get the second sentence, which you see very little written about in many of the commentaries. The second sentence is the city on the hill not being hidden. And guess where the Essenes lived? They lived in a city up on a hill, not accessible to anyone other than their little community. A city on a hill which was shut off to everybody who wasn't part of that in crowd. A bunch of people who claimed to be light, the sons of light, the very light of God, living cloistered away, living guarded little lives, building wealth that was never distributed outside of their own group, and then living under these really strict laws and rigorous supervision. Them and us. Them and us. We're right, they're wrong. We're right, they're wrong. We're the chosen ones. They aren't. We are in, they are out. As I said last week, sounds a bit like church. Sounds a bit like church. Jesus is talking to the folk that are sat on the mountain. They're listening to him. They are a stone's throw away from Qumran. And he's saying to them, you are the ones who should be showing what it means to be a follower of God, not the Essenes. Because what they are doing is they are actually frustrating the divine purpose of God. Because their light isn't being shared with anyone other than their own little clique. That's not the way to live in Messiah's kingdom. That's not the way to live in our community, Jesus is saying. The call of Messiah is to permeate the world, to infuse the world, to infuse it, not to become like the world, but to change the world from within. Change it, hearts, minds, thinking, all of that area of the soul. That's what we're called to do. We're not called to withdraw. We're called to engage. We're called to step in when others step out. We're called to move forward when others retreat. We are called to be bold. We are called to be brave. And we're called to live our lives in a way that reflects the majesty and the light that we carry. Not our light, the light of the Son of God. It's not our light. It's nothing about us. The same way as the moon reflects the light of the physical sun and it casts out darkness, we are called to reflect the light of the sun and cast out darkness. Because light corrects the darkness, doesn't it? And light enhances, promotes, produces, and is conducive for life. Because without light, there is chaos. And without someone to reflect that light, where there is only chaos, there is no hope. And that's exactly what the Essenes thought. Everybody was the children of darkness. Everyone other than them was without hope. They were the carriers of the light, and they were the only ones with hope. Everyone outside had no hope. They were children of darkness. And like I said last week, Jesus doesn't allow this. He steps into humanity. He is truly God. He is truly man. And he says, you know what, actually, the way that you guys are interpreting Scripture needs a workover. It needs a makeover. Because while I am here, everyone has hope. Because I am hope. Amen. That's it. He steps in and he says that. And you know what? For generations and generations and generations, Jesus has been the source of hope for millions and millions and millions of people. And he remains a source of hope today for millions and quite possibly billions of people who are alive today. Hope is found in the person of Jesus. Whether you're a dying thief who was crucified next to him, whether you're a prisoner who's been incarcerated for your crimes, whether you're a junkie who's just looking for his next fix, whether you're some high-flying businessman with the world at your fingertips, Jesus is the only source of hope in this world, at the personal, at the universal, and at the cosmic level. He is the only source of hope. And Jesus, when he's teaching this little similitude on that Sermon on the Mount with all those people around him, he's throwing the gauntlet down to the Essenes by making this comparison for his hearers to pick up on. He's making this comparison. He's saying, and he's actually throwing this challenge out to the Essenes. He's saying, come out. Don't hide yourself away on that city up on the hill where you're hidden away. Come out and do what God has called you to do. Be what God has called you to be, which is light. Bring all of that good stuff. Bring all of that good stuff that you've got going on into the community and share it with the people. Share it with the people. Share it with those that you live around. God hasn't called you to live like this. He's not called you to be light and to be hidden away. He's called you to be light to all of those that are around you. And you can't do that if you don't engage. You can't do that if you don't engage with those around you. And that same call was made to Israel by the Old Testament prophets. And it was the call which was being made by Jesus to those listening to him back in the day. And it is the call today to all those who profess to follow him. It's the same call. It's the same call. You know, folk in this world are still without hope. But they're not without hope if we reflect him to those around us. Then they're not without hope. And we do that by being involved with people. We do that by being involved with our families, with our neighbours, with our community. Not hiding away, fearing that the world is going to contaminate us somehow. Not isolating ourselves behind closed doors or in little Christian settings or anything like that. But by being real people in the real world, dealing with real issues. And then showing the reflected light of the sun, S-O-N, to those who are living in the darkness, to those who live without hope. You know, there's a guy called Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a German pastor, theologian, anti-Nazi dissident, and he was the key founding member of the Confessing Church. And the Confessing Church was a Protestant movement that arose during the time of Nazi Germany and arose in opposition to the Protestant Reich Church. And the Protestant Reich Church was basically a government-sponsored church which was looking to try and unite all of the Protestant denominations under one banner into a single pro-Nazi church. And so Bonhoeffer led this stance against the Nazis, which ultimately led to his imprisonment and then his execution in April 1945. Just as the Nazi regime was collapsing, he was one of the last ones they decided to string up. In his book, The Cost of Discipleship, he wrote this: "Flight into the invisible is a denial of the call. A community of Jesus which seeks to hide itself has ceased to follow him." Flight into the invisible is a denial of the call. A community of Jesus which seeks to hide itself has ceased to follow him. This is what the Essenes were doing. The message to the church today that Jesus says, I think, is this: you need to step into the gap. You need to be the people who God has called you to be. You need to shine. You need to engage. You need to infuse this world with the reality of God in the way that you work, in the way that you live, and the way that you engage with society. You. You're not called to withdraw. A flight into the invisible is a denial of Christ. So, the passage continues in verse 15. And verse 15 says this: "People do not light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house." People do not light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. So, what would the traditional take be on this, perhaps? And then we'll perhaps see where we go from there. I think the key factors would normally sit around the fact that, light, lamp, lampstand, typical Jewish house. This would be what I've seemed to have picked up from the commentaries. Typical Jewish house would have a typical Jewish lamp, and the lamp would need to be placed on a particular stand in order to give the maximum illumination to the rest of the house. And you, as a Christian, are called with your little light to shine Jesus to those around you by evangelizing and by professing your faith and showing the light that you carry, and you make your little light shine, a bit like the little boy with his little lamp, or something like that. Something like that. You know, there's always truth in that. Of course we should be doing that. But is that what Jesus was meaning? Is that what the hearers sat there on the mount would have actually understood when Jesus starts to use this terminology? First up, at the very beginning of that verse, we've got the word in the English there, people. Yeah? I've highlighted it in blue there. People. People. Now this isn't actually in the Greek. This is not in the Greek. This is how the translators have rendered it. The Greek actually says, nor do they light. So that's the Greek. That's the Greek there. And it says, nor do they light. Nor do they light. So why do I mention that? Good question, people. It's a good question for you to ask. Why do I mention that? Let me ask you a question. Who is Jesus actually drawing a comparison to in that first verse that we looked at? I've told you a number of times this morning. So who is Jesus actually drawing a comparison to? The Essenes. The Essenes. Yeah? So, if as we move on to the next verse, he starts by saying, nor do they light, who would be the referent? Who would he be referring to? The Essenes. Yeah? Makes sense, doesn't it? Nor do they, because that's what the Greek says. Nor do they. And he's referring to the Essenes. Interesting. Because he now seems to be using them to further illustrate his teaching. So I want to pull a few words out that Jesus uses as we continue to look at this. It's a really small bit of teaching, but it's got some real punch. Light, lamp, lampstand, basket. I put the lamp and the lampstand together because they flow from a very similar Greek word. As you see in verse 15, we've got that word translated light, haven't we? Light. Translated light in the English, but it's not the same Greek word that's already been used in verse 14. So you see through that in the English, we can see light a number of different times. They're all different words in Greek. So light in verse 14 in Greek is phos. Phos. Light, verse 15 in Greek, is kaiosyn. Kaiosyn. It means to set on fire. Doesn't necessarily mean light. It means to set on fire. And then later on in that verse, we've got another Greek word which has been translated light, and that's lampe, which means to shine. To shine, but it's been translated light. So just in two verses, using the English word light, we've actually got three different Greek meanings. Light, setting on fire, and shining, all translated light. So we've got light, setting on fire, and shining. We've got the source, we've got the doing, we've got the output. We've got the source, we've got the doing, we've got the output. We've got the source, we've got the doing, we've got the output. Keep that in mind as we track on. So, lamp. Luknon. Luknon in the Greek means a lamp or a candlestick, or a lamp or a candle which is placed on a candlestick. And then we've got the lampstand, which is luknion. Luknion. Which is a lampstand or a candelabrum. Then we've got that little word basket in the Old, and in the Old Testament there are at least 4 types of basket that are mentioned in the Old Testament. Why do I tell you this? You know, nothing in the scriptures is there by accident. There's something going on here that Jesus is trying to teach the people, which I think they would have understood, but we're not going to get it because we don't understand this. But if we can unpack it a little bit, we're going to understand a bit more of it. So we've got 4 words for basket in the Old Testament. Dud, sal, keleb, and teni. So dud is a pot or a carrying basket which was sort of carried in the hands. You can read about that in Psalms and Kings and Jeremiah. In Psalm 81, it's this symbol of Egyptian bondage because it linked the basket that the Israelites had to carry the clay bricks in. It was that sort of basket. So it was always linked to bondage. It would have probably been a shallow basket. It's also been used as a pot in 1 Samuel for boiling of meat. And so it may have been used for a whole general expression for vessels of various kinds. Then we've got this little word sal, which was a small dish-shaped basket, perhaps with a little bit of a finer texture. This is the sort of basket that, like the Egyptian baker would have carried on his head with his confectionery and stuff in. That's a sal. It was also the place that the meat of the offering was placed in. It was also the place that the unleavened bread was placed in. And then we've got Caleb, found in Amos 8, which is a fruit basket. I know through fruit baskets. I'm not sure if that's the right translation, but I've met a few fruit baskets in my time. And in Jeremiah, it's known as a bird cage. It's used as a bird cage. Probably some sort of coarsely woven basket with a cover that would have been used by fowlers to catch their little prey in and to cover them up and take them away. And in the New Testament, that word is translated in the Greek as coffinus. That's the basket that's used in the feeding of the 5,000. So it's that sort of basket that's used in the feeding of 5,000. Different to the basket that we're referring to here in this, don't put your light under the basket. We come to Tene, which is the last one, which was this large, deep basket in which they put grain and other field products. And that basket was also the basket that was used to gather the money, the tithes. It was used to gather the wealth, and it was taken to the sanctuary. So it seems as I've tracked through this that the basket that Jesus is referring to in the Greek here is something called modion. And modion is the one that's used for the grain. It's used to measure the grain. So if I'm correct in my belief that Jesus is actually using real people, real places, and drawing on real-time life events in his teaching, and that his focus for illustrative purposes are this little sect that sit in that city on the hill called the Essenes, then Jesus is saying something like this. The Essenes don't set fire to a lamp and put it under a basket, probably a 10e basket. They put it in a place that benefits everyone around them. That makes so much more sense now, doesn't it? And everyone sat there going, no, not really, mate. Not really. Not a lot more sense. Doesn't appear to make much sense to me. What is he actually drawing out here? What is he actually drawing out here in this teaching? Jesus has told his teachers, isn't he, his listeners in verse 14, you are the light of the world. You are the ones that are supposed to be making a difference. You're not like the Essenes. They've got it wrong. And then he draws on the Essenes as an example of something that they do. They do. The Essenes don't set fire to a lamp. If this was something that they did, it would be something that his audience back then would have known. Because he's talking to them in stuff that they understand. They would have gone, oh yeah, well they do that, don't they? Those guys up the road. We know about things that are happening around us with cultures, don't we? Different people. We know that Muslims walk around with a hijab. And so if we talk about hijabs, we would instantly probably go, oh yeah, I can picture that. I can relate to that. I can see that. We know that people who follow Hare Krishna religion tend to shave their head, dress in orange and walk around singing songs, rattling bells. And we know that. We've seen it. We can relate to it. Jesus was speaking to things that people could relate to. His audience would have known it. They wouldn't have escaped him. The question for us is, what did Jesus mean when he used this terminology? And how did he link those things to something that the Essenes were actually doing? What would that hearer back then have heard, and how might they have understood the comparisons? Knowing the Essenes, who sat there in that city hidden on the hill, knowing Torah, knowing that the illusions that Jesus was using, how would they have heard it? And how can we learn anything from it today? There's some crucial sections, I think, in the parallels, because you remember this little light, it's in other stories, isn't it? The little light in the lamp thing, it's in other stories. It's in Luke, it's in Mark. And I think they give us some clues as to what Jesus is getting at here. Mark 4:21-25. I'm just going to read out the blue section. And he said to them, take care about what you hear. The measure you use will be the measure you receive, and more will be added to you. For whoever has will be given more, but whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken from him. And right at the beginning of that, a lamp isn't brought to be put under a basket. So we're talking lamps and baskets, lamps and baskets. Luke 8, 16, 17. No one lights a lamp and covers it in a jar or puts it in bed. Same principle. Verse 18 goes on to say, so listen carefully, for whoever has will be given more. But whoever does not have, even what he thinks he has, will be taken from him. So this would seem to indicate to me that Jesus is actually talking about stuff. He's talking about stuff that you have got. Your wealth, your possessions. How you measure out will be how you will receive. Whoever has, more will be given. And then in Luke 11, when we've got the whole lighting a lamp, hiding it under a basket, in verse 34 it says this, your eye is the lamp of your body. Because when your eye is healthy, your whole body is full of light. When it's diseased, your body is full of darkness. The eye is the lamp of the body. And so we can now link the lamp to the eye. This is what Scripture does. We have all of these things which we can link and draw together, which was a real common understanding in the ancient Near East. They always saw the eye linking to the lamp linking to it. It was a common understanding. It might not be for us, but it was in the ancient Near East. So remember the setting that we're looking at here. Matthew is recording that Jesus is teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. This all sits in that practical discourse of ethics, how we're supposed to live, how we're supposed to conduct ourselves. What does Messiah's kingdom look like on earth? And if we were to flick forward to Matthew 6, you're going to see another comparison being made by Matthew. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye is healthy, your whole body is full of light. And that little verse there, if your eye is healthy, can also be rendered this. If you are generous. If you are generous. Conversely, if your eye is diseased, can be rendered if you're not generous. So this has got to be understood in the terms of its context. And this context is all about money. More specifically, the love of money, mammon. So Jesus is drawing a comparison here with the eye and light and darkness. And in the setting that we're talking about, that we're looking at, he's using real-time events to make his point. You see, in first century Hebraic culture, if you were described as having an eye full of light, you were generous. If you had an evil eye, you were tight. You were stingy. That was the understanding. First century Rabbi Hillel spoke on giving, and he spoke on the giving of the offering, the terumah. And he says if a person honours terumah, the offering, at a 1/40th level, his eye is said to be full of light. If he honours terumah at a 1/50th level, his eye is said to be a middling eye. And if he honours terumah at 1/60th level, that person has an evil eye. And the one who doesn't honour terumah at all is an infidel. And terumah was the offering that you'd give to the man of God. Man of God didn't receive a salary. He lived off the offering that was given to him by the people that he served. And this process was ditched around the time of Constantine, when the church became wedded to the state and the teachings that underpinned the church were ripped out. And now we lose much. We lose much of our understanding, which is only slowly being recovered. For the last 70 years, it's being recovered. And when I was thinking on this yesterday, when did the Jewish state form? It's only been since the forming of the Jewish state again that we're actually now beginning to understand some of the Jewish traditions and Jewish foundations of our faith. Interesting. And in Jewish understanding, two things were linked: righteousness and generosity. Hebrew words sidak and sidaka. Righteousness and generosity. The only difference was the hay. And the hay is the breath of God. So the eye in Hebraic understanding was linked to generosity. In rabbinical understanding, if you had an evil eye, you were tight. If you had an eye full of light, you were generous. And in Hebrew, generosity and righteousness go hand in hand. They are linked linguistically and they are linked theologically. Now that sort of comment is often received with dismay by those who will argue the toss about what God says about wealth and how we steward wealth. It's really funny. I find it really funny. Some Christians, they really, really struggle to live under the grace and the liberty that Jesus has won for them. And they still insist that folk must do this and you must do that and you must do that and you've got to do this. Except when it comes to money. And then they will live under grace. They will live under grace because they'll say, well, my heart tells me what I should do and I live under grace. But for everything else, they are religious. For some, it's the only area of grace that they're happy to live under. The rest of the time, they live under these shackles of religion. But grace rules supreme when it comes to me having to put my hand in my pocket. Grace rules supreme then. So, could it be that what Jesus is actually talking about here is he's actually making comparisons of generosity when he speaks about light? And then the stretch of that generosity. Because if Jesus was making that comparisons, what we'd see is that the Essenes actually used their wealth to benefit only each other. And that was the stretch of their generosity. So if what I'm saying is right, we would see that being played out. So is that true? Is this what the Essenes actually did? Did they actually hoard their wealth for the benefit of their own only? Remember, they've got this document called the Manual of Discipline, which is a Hebrew document, and it was written for new members, and what it was laying out and it was stressing was the relationship between the Essenes and everybody else who was an outsider, all the others. And in one of the scrolls, 1 Qumran scroll 5:14-20, it says this: so no member shall be united with him, the outsider, in his work or in his wealth, lest he defile the member with guilty iniquity. But distance shall be kept from him in every matter. No member shall eat from their property, nor drink from it, nor take anything from their hands except by payment. For all who are not accounted as in his covenant keep them separate, and all that belongs to them, and all their deeds filthiness before him, and uncleanness is in all their wealth. None of the Essenes will be united with an outsider in his work or in his wealth. Don't flash your cash outside the city. Don't do it. So is there anything else about wealth that the Essenes talk about? Well, funnily enough, there is. And the wealth belonging to the men of holiness, i.e. the members of the Essene sect, who walk in perfection, their wealth shall not be mingled with the wealth belonging to men of deceit, i.e. everybody else, who have not cleansed their way to be separated from iniquity and to work in perfection of way. Wealth shall not be mingled with all of the other people. You see, what the Essenes did is they took their wealth that they had and they shared it amongst themselves. They shared it amongst themselves. Their world was a city hidden on a hill. All who were part of it were blessed with the wealth that was shared within it. That was it. The deep baskets for gathering up the cash was made available to only those who were within scope. The holy, the sons of light, the ones who were behind the doors. This sharp contrast between light and darkness reveals itself in the economic structure of their community. They guarded their community of wealth through their strict laws and their rigorous supervision. And it was something that was well known to the folk of Jesus' day. They understood that. And Jesus used them as an example as to what he wanted to teach about his kingdom. What it was like to live under his rule. And so he takes their language and he uses it to make a point. And he uses the Essenes as an example of what not to be. A people who hide away from the world. A people who are locked into their own way of thinking, who never give hope to others. A people limiting their wealth and their resources only to those within their little clique, to their little scope. And he turned that image on its head by making the folk around them prick up their ears by actually saying, you are the light. You are the light. You are the special ones, and your playground, your scope, is the world. Because you are the light of the world. And you are supposed to infuse the world. With what? Your generosity. Your wealth. The Essenes didn't take all that good stuff. The stuff that enhances, promotes, produces, and is conducive to life. All their wealth, and hide it away from each other, did they? They pushed it out into their community. Out into their house. so that everyone in their little community could be blessed by it. They didn't keep it for themselves. They blessed their community. And Jesus is saying the same to you. And he was saying the same to them, sat on the Sermon on the Mount. Except your scope, your community, is the world. The world. And all you are given is given to you to bless the world. You are blessed to be a blessing. Start at home. Start in your own house. Start in your own family. And increase your stretch. Because this is the practical ethic that Jesus is instructing his people to live by and to be known by. You are the light of the world. You are the ones that are called to be a blessing. And if I'm right, we will see that Jesus confirms that in verse 16. This is no word of knowledge, but I know he does. Let's pray. Jesus, I thank you. I thank you for your amazing teaching. I thank you for the richness of your word. Lord, I pray that you'd give us ears to hear what you are still speaking to us 2,000 years on, Lord. And let us be a people who are willing to share you, to reflect you in this world around us, in the way that we conduct ourselves. And Lord, and how we honour you through our generosity to those who come under your radar, Lord. And come across our radar. Lord, I thank you for your many blessings. Thank you for your many blessings. We are indeed blessed in order to bless. And may we never forget, Lord, that duty which is placed upon us. And may our generosity and may our righteousness flow hand in hand. Lord, I just bless your folk this morning, I pray. And may they grow in their love for you and their love for each other and their love for the world beyond. Amen. Amen. There you go. Cheers, guys. Thanks for listening.